back to our study on the book of Mark. And as we talked a little bit last week, we talked about how context was so important when studying the Bible. Context within the verse, context within the section of the book, was context within the book itself, and then context within the Testament that you're studying, and then context within the Bible as a whole. And then I have over here in kind of little letters, context within history. In today's study, we're going to spend a little bit more time than we might normally do looking at this context within history. So a little bit abnormal, I guess, from that standpoint of what we normally do. But it's important, I think, to understand the text this time. So just a real brief review. We've had conflict heightening with the religious establishment as we've progressed through the book of Mark. And it especially has heightened as Jesus makes his triumphal entry into Jerusalem, and the crowds are they're really excited and all worked up into a frenzy, and that's going to make the religious established jealous because they're losing this honor-shame game. To make matters worse, Jesus comes in and he curses the fig tree and he clears out the temple, and then they go back out and they see that the fig tree that he had cursed had died, and we talked about how that was representative of where Israel was, especially the establishment of Israel at this point. And then they challenge him on whose authority he had to do this, to clear out the temple. And he refuses to answer them directly, but he answers them with a question about John the Baptist. Whose authority did he have? And if you answer that, then you answer the question of where Jesus' authority, and they refuse to answer that question. So Jesus refused to answer their question as well. And then that kind of flows into the parable of the vineyard. And we see from Mark 12:12 that they understood that Jesus spoke that parable of the vineyard against against the religious establishment. They were the vine growers that had beaten the servants of God, and even the son of the vine owner, or the vineyard owner, and so he was going to remove the vineyard from them, is what the parable says, and they understood that was against them. So that leads us into where we are today, and what we see is we have three sequential attacks on Jesus that are going to take place today. One's on paying taxes to Caesar. The next is an attack on resurrection and marriage, and then the final one is what's known as the greatest commandment. So I think Mark is intentionally building the tension, and it's leading us up to the cross. So as we enter in today, we see that several times they've challenged Jesus, and every time they've challenged him, and they've primarily tried to challenge him up to this point through religious challenges, by theological challenges. And so in today's text, we're going to see, let's try politics. We couldn't stump him on theology, so let's try to stump him on politics. So that's where they attempt to go today. Verse 13 of chapter 12 says, "Then they sent some of the Pharisees and Herodians to him in order to trap him in a statement." So what's their motivation here? The motivation is they're trying to trap Jesus. Matthew 22 gives us a little bit more information on what's going on here as well. Matthew 22 says, "And they sent their disciples along with the Herodians." So we get a little bit more information there that they sent their disciples, and you might ask, why send their disciples instead of them coming themselves? Well, they failed personally numerous occasions so far with Jesus. So this time they take another tactic. They send their disciples, and if they fail this time, it's not as much shame lost, or not as much shame on them, not as much honor lost for them, because it's their underlings this time. And then on the flip side of that, if their underlings do win the honor shame challenge, then they could say, well, you can't even beat our disciples, so you're not worth our time, Jesus. So this was a tactic that Matthew gives us a hint at that Mark does not. So here's what the challenge is. First of all, we learn from that text in both of these, from Mark and Matthew, that the Pharisees and the Herodians team up. And these are strange bedfellows. And what they think they're doing by teaming up with these two groups that don't get along very well, they think they're going to put Jesus in a position between a rock and a hard place. Because here's the historical context and the scene of what's going on here. Remember, this is a political attack that they're trying to come at Jesus with this time. And the Pharisees, while they are considered to be very theologically liberal because they have all these stacks of extra laws, versus the Sadducees, who would have been very theologically conservative, the Sadducees believed in only teaching from the first 5 books of the Bible, the Pentateuch, the law. So they were very theologically liberal, were the Pharisees. They were theologically liberal because they added all this other stuff on. So, but while they were theologically liberal, they were very much politically conservative, very politically conservative. So the way you can read that is they would not be in favor of paying taxes to Rome. Herodians, on the other hand, we talked about the Herodians, and that comes from Herod. Remember King Herod the Great? He's the one that brought about the genocide of the Jewish baby boys at the time of Jesus' birth. That's that same family. We talked about them a little bit during the John the Baptist encounter. But the Herodians were very much politically liberal. They were almost kind of what you could consider a half-breed Jew. They were from way down south in Idumea, which is really kind of on the outskirts of Israel territory here. So, and they weren't full Jews, the Herodians. They came into power by basically paying off Rome. The king of the Jews title went to whomever was willing to pay Rome the most. So that's how they came into office. So you would read, when you read Herodians, you would read that they would be supportive of paying taxes, because that's what's holding up and propping up their power, is the Romans. So Pharisees were against paying taxes. The Herodians were for paying taxes, essentially. So watch how they try to catch Jesus in the middle. They came to him and they said, "Teacher." Oh man, anytime we see the word teacher used in the book of Mark, it's not a title of honor for Jesus. People either don't understand who Jesus is, or they're trying to undermine who Jesus is. And I think that's the case this time, that they're using it as kind of an undermining. Because listen to the next word, teacher. We know, and just listen to the way I think the tone would have been read in this text as they're saying this to Jesus. Teacher, we know that you are truthful and defer to no one, for you are not partial to any, but teach the way of God in truth. Is it lawful to pay a poll tax to Caesar or not? See, they were silver-tongued here. They're paying Jesus compliments, but they didn't really want to honor him at all, right? So the question would have been a powder keg issue in Israel at that time. And even in our time, right? I mean, the Boston Tea Party was a pretty big deal. It was all surrounding taxes. Even as late as 4 years ago, on our political scene, the Tea Party was a big political influence on the elections a few years back. So taxes are always a big political issue. And it certainly was the case in the day of Jesus's day. There's a story told by Josephus in Antiquities 18:4, where and this took place about 6 AD, so not too long before Jesus' ministry is on the scene, just a couple of decades before this. But Josephus writes about this guy named Judas of Galilee, and who was this insurrectionist who was revolting against taxes. And this is what Judas of Galilee, or what Josephus said Judas of Galilee says. Yet there was a man named Judas who became zealous to draw them to a revolt, who said this taxation was no better than an introduction to slavery, and he exhorted the nation to assert their liberty. So just a couple of decades before Jesus' ministry, we see that there's this powder keg issue led by this Judas of Galilee. Judas of Galilee his insurrection didn't amount to much, as you might imagine. So here's how the text moves on as we are couched in this powder keg issue of taxation. Shall we pay or shall we not pay? But he, Jesus, knowing their hypocrisy, said to them, why are you testing me? Bring me a denarius to look at. Now that's going to be important, I think, in just a moment. Bring me a denarius. Jesus didn't have one with him right now. So what you see on the screen right now is an image of the coin that was very likely an image of the coin that, like what Jesus had brought to him, or something similar to this anyway. So we'll look at both sides of the coin here. As you look at the image that's on your screen right now, you're going to see this picture of this guy, and that is the Emperor Tiberius, who would have been reigning at the time when Jesus is speaking this. And what you see around the coin is Latin abbreviation. And the inscription says Tiberius Caesar Divine, okay? And then it also says Emperor, son of Augustus, God. So this side A of the coin, the head side, says Tiberius, divine son of God, okay? The B side of the coin, the inscription says Pontiff Maximum, or Pontiff Maxim, which means high priest. So the image that's on this side, in addition to the inscription that I just read, is an image of Livia, who's Augustus' third wife and is the mother of Tiberius. And she's sitting on a throne holding an olive branch, which is pretty much a universal symbol for peace. And in the other hand, she's holding a spear, which represents and is one of the key symbols of the false god Pax, which means peace. So what it's saying here is peace is obtained by the blade. So his mama is portrayed on this side as a goddess who brings peace. So when you put these two images together, we have what is utter blasphemy to the Jews. It says Tiberius is the high priest, son of a god and goddess. All right, so understanding that, let's see what's wrong with that picture. You see, Jews were adamantly opposed to having graven images in the temple. And so here we have a teaching illustration. Jesus says, bring me a coin, and he's holding it up and he's saying, look at what's on this thing. And he's making this main point as they bring that to him. And it's also important to understand another historical context issue. I told you we were going to look at historical context quite a bit today, but in Josephus' Jewish Wars 2.9, it talks about when Pontius Pilate is described as bringing graven images into the city of Jerusalem. And the Jewish people just went crazy for 5 days. There were heated discussions with the Jewish leaders during which he lures them into a situation where all the Jewish leaders are gathered together, and Pilate unveils that he has an army surrounding the meeting. And Pilate demands, not only will they come into the city, but we're going to take them into your temple. And if you don't like it, we're going to kill you now. And in an incredible show of solidarity, all the Jewish leaders bent down on their knee and extended their neck and said, do what you will. So this just gives us a historical context. This was how big of a deal it was for an image of Rome to be brought into Jerusalem, much less the temple. Okay, so that's how big of an issue it is. People were willing to lay down their lives for this point. So Jesus says, "Oh, I'm sorry, I don't seem to have one of the coins that you would use to pay the emperor with. Okay, you used to pay your taxes. Oh, by the way, that coin has graven images with blasphemous titles on it. Could someone grab one of those coins for me so we can take a look at it? So we can look at these graven images that are on the coin, that are in hand in the temple? Why would you even want this thing?" Jesus says. Mark 12, 16 through 17 says, "They brought him one, and he said to them, 'Whose likeness and inscription is on this coin?' And they said to him, 'Caesar's.' And Jesus said to them, 'Render to Caesar the things that are Caesar's, and to God the things that are God.' And they were amazed at him." Why were they amazed? Because he had navigated this landmine, right? Jesus says, "It has this image on it. Give it to him. You don't need the stinking thing, anything. Why would you want it anyway? Why do you strive and fight over an image of a false god? Trust in the one true God, not in this false god." There might be some application for this today, right? I mean, do we place money up as a false god? I think certainly we can make that argument. But if we have the correct lens of the kingdom, we don't, they wouldn't want this blasphemous coin, this graven image to a false god in Jerusalem in the first place. So give the stinking idol back to the emperor, because it has no value in God's kingdom. In effect, Jesus is saying, who do you trust more, God or the money which represents the Pax Romana, the peace of Rome? And so he navigates that landmine, and they are amazed at him. So they could not trap him religiously or theologically. And so they tried to attack him politically, and he politically navigated that grenade, and they were amazed at how he was able to do that. So as we look at how he navigated that, he did say, "Render to Caesar what is Caesar, and render to God what is God's." So what is God's? Genesis 1:26 says, "Then God said, let us make man in our image, according to our likeness." So what's he saying there? Render to Caesar what is Caesar, render what is God, what is God's. Ultimately, what God wants is not a blasphemous coin. Ultimately, what God wants is you, is us, is humans, to submit to him and trust in him. And the question would say, wait, you want me to give up my coin and give up my life? And that leads us back to the two-phase healing of the blind man, where Jesus spits and rubs his hand on the guy, and he says, "How do you see?" And he says, "Things look like trees and upside down." And then he rubs his hands together again, touches the guy, and says, "What about now?" "Oh, now I see." You see, all this time they're seeing politically, theologically, every aspect of life, they're seeing things fuzzy and upside down. They don't understand the ways of Jesus and his kingdom. So the next passage that we're going to look at as Jesus navigates that landmine of politics, he now is going to be asked a question, which a lot of times we interpret this as a text, and we use it as a proof text on teaching about whether there will be marriage and whether there will be sex in heaven. And I'm going to point out, I just think that is wrong. I think that's not the point of this passage at all. So as we study this next section, we have to know something about the historical context here. The Sadducees, and the text points this out, the Sadducees don't even believe in the question that they're forming here. The Sadducees are religious conservatives and do not believe in the resurrection. They hold that belief because they hold that you only follow what's in the first 5 books, the law, right? And so there's no mention of the resurrection in those first 5 books. And so that's why they don't believe in it. So Mark goes on in 12:18, he says, some Sadducees who were saying that there is no resurrection came to Jesus and began questioning him, saying. So Mark tells us, and that's an important parenthetical statement that Mark gives us there, is who say there is no resurrection. And it goes on, it says, teacher. We see that word again, teacher. They don't get who Jesus is, right? Teacher, Moses wrote for us. See, they're going to Moses. They're going to the law. Moses wrote for us that if a man's brother dies and leaves behind a wife and leaves no child, his brother should marry the wife and raise up his children to his brother. So the appeal is to the law, Moses, first 5 books. And so this is what they're referring to from Deuteronomy 25, 5 through 6. When brothers live together and one of them dies and has no son, the wife of the deceased shall not be married outside the family to a strange man. Her husband's brother shall go into her and take her to himself as wife and perform the duty of a husband's brother to her. It shall be that the firstborn whom she bears shall assume the name of his dead brother, so that his name would not be blotted out from from Israel. So what's the issue here? Is it an issue of whether there will be sex in heaven or marriage in heaven? No. When you look at it in context of what is being quoted here, they're asking a question about honor. Read verse 6 of Deuteronomy 6. It shall be that the firstborn whom she bears shall assume the name of his dead brother, so that his name will not be blotted out from Israel. If your name is blotted out, you have no honor. So this would have been a majorly shameful situation here. And what this Deuteronomy passage is laying out is something that's called the Levirate marriage protocol, I guess you'd say. And so what it's dealing with is provision and legacy and honor. That's what the Levirate marriage discussion and debate is about here. So it goes on. The Sadducees, who don't believe in the resurrection, continue this question in setting up this scenario. There were 7 brothers. This is from 12:20 of Mark. There were 7 brothers, and the first took a wife and died, leaving no children. The second one married her and died, leaving behind no children, and the third likewise. And so all 7 left no children. Last of all, the woman died also. In the resurrection, that they don't believe in, right? In the resurrection, when they rise again, which one's wife will she be? For all 7 had married her. Wait, I don't understand. Sadducees don't believe in the resurrection, so why are they even asking this? Well, they're testing Jesus. They're trying to trap him. And they're trying to make fun of the resurrection by setting up this absurd, convoluted scenario. So in this scenario, the woman is barren. She is shameful. Remember, in this honor-shame culture in society, the only way that women in this culture had value was if they could bring a male child to the husband, because otherwise they were just treated like cattle. The only thing they were good for in this mindset was to cook dinner and to birth them a male child specifically. And certainly Jesus has blown this apart already, that whole mindset of how women are, that he's talked already that women are created in his image, right? And they are to be honored. So this woman in this text, she is 7 times a widow, entirely cursed 7 times. 7 is the number of completion. So another little bit of historical context on this story too, is there's an intertestamental apocryphal book called Tobit, written around the 2nd century BC, so before Jesus is born. A woman named Sarah was widowed 7 times, okay? And there was this demon would come in, and as they're trying to exact this Levirate marriage policy and procedure, this demon would come in and kill the husband before they could consummate the marriage, until this guy named Tobias was able to come up with a plan to keep the demon away, and he was able to consummate the marriage, and thus fulfilling the Levirate marriage standard. So it doesn't matter if you believe this story to be true or part of canon. The point is, this story to which they are probably making reference to, it would have been very familiar, and it sounds pretty much the same story in the scenario that they are living out here, or playing out with this dispute with Jesus. So 24 goes on, and it says, Jesus said to them, "Is it not the reason you are mistaken? Is this not the reason you are mistaken, that you do not understand the scripture or the power of God?" Wow. You see, Sadducees were part of the elite, right? This would have been like going up to an Ivy League Rhodes Scholar from Harvard, who has an economics degree, and telling him that you don't understand the principles of the laws of supply and demand. That's kind of what this is equivocal to. Is it not that you reason you are mistaken? You don't understand scriptures. Oh boy, those are fighting words. And as we say in West Tennessee, where I'm from, them's fighting words, boy. So we see that being played out here. But what does he say? You don't understand the scriptures or the power of God. What's the power of God that he's referring to? The resurrection. That's what they don't understand. The premise of their question is dripping with sarcasm and poking fun at the resurrection in the first place, with this ridiculous story that they're bringing with them. And so Jesus is saying, your whole premise of your understanding here is false, because the resurrection is true. And this is how he goes on. For when, not if, but when they rise from the dead, they will neither marry nor are given in marriage, but are like angels in heaven. So when indicates the problem of their first premise, because the dead will rise. And in this honor and provision is what Jesus is pointing to here, that honor and provision are given by God just like he gives it to the angels. It's not earned, or does it come from having any sons. Remember the false question that they're setting up is, this woman is a burden, and she's 7 times cursed. So in the resurrection, who's going to be married to her? And that's the question that they're asking. And Jesus is saying she's no burden any more than any other person is. She's God's burden, just like any man is God's burden. She bears the image of God. She is God's responsibility, just like the angels and just like everyone else. Verse 26 goes on to say, but regarding the fact that the dead rise again, have you not read? Man, he's poking at the elite nature of these guys again. Have you not read the book of Moses? In the passage about the burning bush, how God spoke to him saying, I am the God of Abraham and the God of Isaac and the God of Jacob. He is not the God of the dead, but of the living. You are greatly mistaken. So where does Jesus go to land the point? He goes to the Old Testament, to the Pentateuch, to the law, right? Have you not read the book of Moses? Okay, he's going to these Sadducees' primary text that they go to. So we got to look at the verb tense here. The verb tense is I am the God of Abraham. And he says, I am the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, but he's talking to Moses. Well, the problem is for the Sadducees, with God saying the present tense that I am the God of Abraham, is that Abraham, Isaac, Jacob were all physically dead at this point. So he's saying this to Moses at the burning bush. So he's saying they're not dead, they're living. So he's making the point for the resurrection here. Verse 28 says, one of the scribes came and heard them arguing, and recognizing that he had answered them well, asked him, what commandment is the foremost of all? So if you just read Mark's account on this, you might think that this guy is honest in his question, but we need to flip over to Matthew to get the heart of this guy. Same guy, different passage from the parallel account in Matthew. It says, but when the Pharisees heard that Jesus had silenced the Sadducees, they gathered themselves together. One of them, a lawyer, asked him a question, testing him. So what was his intent? It was to test him. So the Sadducees failed, so let's send in the Pharisees to clean up the mess that the Sadducees made. That's kind of what's going on here. So they're all still, the establishment's still trying to test Jesus. Mark 12:29-30 says, Jesus answered, the foremost is, hear, O Israel, the Lord our God is one, the Lord, and you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your mind, and with all your strength. So this is a reference to the great Shema from Deuteronomy chapter 6. There's still Sadducees in the crowd, even though he's interacting with a Pharisee, so he's still going back to Deuteronomy. This is huge because it's the definition of the relationship between God and his people. In the historical picture of the life of Israel, it comes after the great Exodus, after the Ten Commandments are delivered, and right before they enter into this deep covenantal relationship between Israel and God in the Promised Land. So Deuteronomy 6, where the great Shema is in place, right in the middle of this text of Deuteronomy 6, it goes like this. Now, this is the commandment, the statutes and the judgments, which the Lord your God has commanded me to teach you, that you might do them in the land where you are going over to possess it, so that you and your sons and your grandsons might fear the Lord your God, to keep all his statutes and his commandments. So here's twice now, that you might do them, these commandments. And now he's saying, you got to keep the statutes and the commandments, which I command you, all the days of your life, and that your days may be prolonged. O Israel, you should listen and be careful to do it. There's 3 times in 3 verses. Every verse he's saying, you got to do the laws. You got to live it out, right? That it may be well with you, and that you may multiply greatly, just as the Lord, the God of your fathers, has promised in the land of flowing with milk and honey. So there's a latent threat in this, because it's, if you obey, then you will be blessed and multiply greatly and get milk and honey, right? If you don't, hear the latent threat in that? Okay. The text goes on in Deuteronomy 4-9 of chapter 6 says, hear, O Israel, this is the great Shema. Hear, O Israel, the Lord is our God, the Lord is one. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your might. These words which I am commanding you today shall be on your heart. You shall teach them diligently to your sons, and shall talk of them when you sit down in your house, and when you walk by the way, and when you lie down, and when you rise up. You shall bind them as a sign on your hand, and they shall be frontals on your forehead. You shall write them on doorposts of your house and on your gates. Then it shall come about, when the Lord your God brings you into the land which he swore to your fathers, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, to give you great and splendid cities which you did not build, and houses of all good things which you did not fill, and hewn cisterns which you did not dig, vineyards and olive trees which you did not plant, and you eat and are satisfied. Then watch yourself that you do not forget the Lord who brought you from the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery. So who provided all this stuff? Who provided the cities and the cisterns that were dug, and the olive tree groves that were planted? God did, right? That's what he's saying. He's saying, don't forget, I brought you up out of Egypt, and I've provided you all this stuff. Don't forget. You got to keep these commandments. You got to write them on your forehead, keep them on your arms so that they're top of mind. Do not forget. And obey, obey, obey. 3 times he says obey in Deuteronomy chapter 6. So he's saying, I'm not just giving you a list of all laws. I'm giving you a distinctive identity from a lost and lonely world. Not just a list, but the heart of it is to love God with all your heart and with all your soul, with all your might. Oh man, we got to keep that in mind. We can't get so bogged down with the list of rules that we forget the very heart of God. So Mark, he says the second is this. Matthew words it a little bit different. He says the second is like it. And you could think, well, what's greater than loving God? That's kind of weird what Jesus is saying here. So what would be the natural question before you get to that? Well, Mark 12:31 says, the second is this, you shall love your neighbor as yourself. There is no other commandment greater than these. So in Leviticus, after a list of a bunch of laws, it goes like this. It gives a list of things to do and not do. But in verse 14 of Leviticus 19, it says, you shall not curse a deaf man, nor place a stumbling block before the blind, but you shall revere your God. I am the Lord. See how treating people and treating God are intertwined here. Leviticus 19:18 says, you shall not take vengeance nor bear any grudge against the sons of your people, but you shall love your neighbor as yourself. I am the Lord. Okay. So in that Leviticus 19 passage, when you read it in full, it goes on and it talks about you shall do no injustice in judgment. You shall not be partial to the poor nor defer the great. Rich young ruler listening up to this, right? But you are to judge your neighbor fairly. You shall not go about slandering among your people, and you are not to act against the life of your neighbor. Parable of the vine growers, anyone? I am the Lord, it says. You shall not hate your fellow countrymen. So to love God, we can't come up and give him a hug, right? So how do we love God? How is the second like the first? The first law was love God. How is the second like the first? If you want to accomplish the first, you do the second, because that's how God has told us that we can show love to him by loving people. Think about it further. God is consistent with this principle. Think about the 10 Commandments, for example. The first 4 commandments deal with how we should treat God. The second 6, or the second set there of 6 there, is dealing with how we treat people. So you love God by doing these 4 things, and you love people by doing the last 6 things in the list. The principle continues to be developed as John writes about it in 1 John 4:20 through 21. If someone says, I love God, and hates his brother, he is a liar. You can't say you hate your brother and say that you love God. That's what John's saying. For the one who does not love his brother whom he has seen cannot love God whom he has not seen. I can go up and give my brother a hug. I can't go up and give God a hug. So how do I show love to God? I go up and I hug my brother. I can't hate him. Verse 21 of John 4 says, and this commandment we have from him, the one who loves God should love his brother also. So John further develops this thought that's presented in the Old Testament, ratified by Christ in his teaching, and now further developed by John. And he turns these 2 greatest commandments and makes them essentially one, because they are. Mark 12:32 through 33, the scribe said to him, right, teacher, you have truly stated that he is one, and there is no one else besides him, and to love him with all the heart and with all the understanding, with all the strength, and to love one's neighbor as himself is much more than all the burnt offerings and sacrifices. So this guy basically parrots back exactly what Jesus says. Don't miss that he called him teacher here, right? Right, teacher, you have truly stated. Okay? He calls him teacher. So keep that in mind as we go forward. So he adds something to what Jesus said here, much more than all the burnt offerings and sacrifices. I think what this guy is referring to is a passage in Isaiah 1. I'm going to read just bits and pieces of it, but if you have time, go back and read all of Isaiah 1. It says, "Listen, O heaven, and hear, O earth, for the Lord speaks. Sons I have reared and brought up, but they have revolted against me. An ox knows its owner, and a donkey its master, but Israel does not know. My people do not understand. Alas, sinful nation, people weighted down with iniquity, offspring of evildoers, sons who act corruptly. They have abandoned the Lord. They have despised the Holy One of Israel. They have turned away from him. Where will you be stricken again as you continue in your rebellion? The whole head is sick, and the whole heart is faint." And he goes on. That was down through verse 4. I'll pick up down in verse 11 of Isaiah chapter 1. What are your multiplied sacrifices to me, says the Lord? I've had enough of burnt offerings and rams and the fat of the fed cattle, and I take no pleasure in the blood of bulls, lambs, or goats. When you come to appear before me, who requires of you this trampling of my courts? Bring your worthless offerings no longer. Incense is an abomination to me. New moons and Sabbath festivals, the calling of assemblies, I cannot endure iniquity and the solemn assembly. I hate your new moon festivals and your appointed feasts. They have become a burden to me. I am weary of bearing them. So when you spread out your hands in prayers, I will hide my eyes from you. Yes, even though you multiply prayers, I will not listen. Your hands are covered with blood. So the text goes on. I encourage you to go on and read it, but you get the sense and the idea. I think this is what this Pharisee who's calling Jesus teacher is referring to. The burnt offerings and sacrifices are a burden, and even this guy gets it. Jesus commends him a little bit here in verse 34. He says, when you saw that he had answered intelligently, when Jesus saw that he had answered intelligently, he said to him, you are not far from the kingdom of God. Oh, you're getting pretty close. You get love God, love people. You get that the whole sacrificial system is a mess right now. You understand all that. You're not far off. He was close, but what's he missing? Verse 32, how's he referring to Jesus? Teacher. He was this close, but he didn't get the identity of who Jesus is. That's so huge in the book of Mark. Whenever we see that word teacher, it gives us hints of where people's hearts are. He didn't understand at this point. So it goes on, it says they would not venture to ask him any more questions. You think? The question route hasn't been working out real well for them. So they're going to have to try something else. And we know that that's going to lead us to the cross. So our application in all of this, first of all, we can't miss the application of understanding the identity of who Jesus is. We got to understand that he's Lord. He's not just some Santa Claus figure that we bring our list of Christmas requests in the form of a prayer when we need him. That's not the true identity of God. He's not just some figure that brings us salvation. He is that, but that's not all he is. He is Lord, and we have to submit to him. We have to be like the Israelites. We have to obey what he commands us to do because he's our Lord. Not because of the list of the rules, but because he is who he says he is, and we have to understand that. And he says he is Lord. The second application is we got to watch our hearts. We can't just go through this litany of rules and regulations and say, oh, look how I am on the outside. And at the same time, our hearts are wicked, like is described in the Isaiah passage that we read. What we have to be is our definition of what a disciple is. A disciple is being changed in the head by Jesus, is being changed in the heart by Jesus, and is being changed in the hands by Jesus. So we have to be that full scoped definition of a disciple of Jesus. So let's go out and try to live that way today. Have a good day.